John Skipper leaving Meadowlark Media as part of broader changes around the Dan Le Batard Show. So there's a lot going on here, Ben. We know for sure that John Skipper is leaving the company. He co-founded this he was obviously the former president of ESPN. He left under unceremonious circumstances like a decade ago and then resurfaced after some little jobs here and there when Le Batard left ESPN. They co-founded this Meadowlark Media company. We were all, I think, in this world a little bit uncertain as to what the company was exactly or was trying to be. They did some documentary deals, they did some narrative podcast stuff, and now he's gone. We know that because Le Batard thanked him on X, confirmed that Meadowlark's going to continue to do some of that film and documentary stuff. But I think we would all agree the main things that they're known for remain the Dan Le Batard Show with Stugotz, and to a lesser degree, Pablo Torre Finds Out, which Pablo Torre launched a couple years ago and has grown pretty quickly, got some awards and everything else, does like investigative journalism and real, things that have broken through and really made an impact. But that show, the signature Dan Le Batard Show, is also undergoing some changes where Barrett Media reported that Stugotz, John Wiener, is stepping back, quote unquote. Little uncertain what that exactly means. And if you look at it from one direction, it might not be that much of a change from his role for the past year or so. He's been on less and less. He already, had only been on 3-4 days a week, even throughout the entirety of the post-ESPN era of this show. So let's just kind of stop there and survey the landscape of those changes before we get into anything big picture. What do you make of this? Bad timing? Maybe a bigger deal than the headlines would suggest? Or is it actually this is a really significant media story?
It's hard for me to imagine that the Skipper news is good news. And I don't know too much about like what went into that, but the fact that they're up for their next deal, right? Like that's kind of in the backdrop of all of this is their deal with DraftKings is set to expire. Dan said in March, in a few months. I think if you put together the timeline of when the deal started, it's probably a safe assumption that sometime around June is when the deal expires.
Yeah, initially 3 years, and then it seems like up for one more last year. But
yeah, I don't know if there was an option or something, but yeah.
Hard to tell. And now it seems like they're really up against it.
Yeah, and that's, and in the backdrop of all that then is that DraftKings has obviously undergone shifts in its own strategy when it comes to content. And so I think it's fair to wonder like how interested they would be in doing a similar deal. The reporting has indicated like they've been in talks, but here we are, thinking we're probably a month out from this thing and there's still no deal. Dan, alluded to in his statement about Skipper that they had exciting news to share when it came to audio and video distribution. So you would think it's either a DraftKings deal, either they're re-upping with DraftKings or finding a new home. But I think that's, I think these are kind of, obviously these are all connected in a way, but I think the Skipper one, that one, just the timing doesn't seem great for one of your co-founders and, effectively, I think he was, their CEO, for him to leave before this new deal kicks in. I don't think that's probably great. And in terms of Stugotz,
well, it was can I jump in on that part?
Sure.
I think so I would say that I have pretty solid confidence that even with the changes, which we'll get to with Stugotz and other people that have happened to the Le Batard Show, like we all know, it's still a pretty significant headline maker. It's still very popular. When you look at the deals that any number of shows, distribution deals that they've gotten, whether it's like Rich Eisen and what he's doing, peppering his stuff across a bunch of platforms of syndication, or it's even just digital first, like, the Kelseys are the top level example, but whatever you want to look at, there's a market for the Dan Le Batard Show. I don't know if it's at DraftKings, but they're going to make that show and it surviving as the anchor of the network makes sense to me. Now, the thing that has to happen there is like that show has to be big enough for somebody to pay enough for it to fund all the other stuff. Right? Because like I don't think anything else they've done has been regular enough or successful enough to tell me that it's funding itself in perpetuity, right? Like I don't think that that's what's going to happen. So maybe from one angle you could look at it and say, well, that was Skipper's side of the business. Le Batard had his side. And maybe that side, I know in the statement, Dan said like they're going to continue to produce it, but if it's at a significantly less volume, maybe they just don't need Skipper and we see them hire, you know, what the Volume and Barstool and these types of people have hired, which is more just these very savvy, I know how to go to Spotify or NBC or Sirius and get deals done. And if that's the type of person, that is a little different than what Skipper had been doing. We know Skipper wants to do journalism and he wants to be, you know, impactful and progressive and all these things. And maybe that just didn't really fit if that stuff wasn't really coming to fruition. So I could see it, but it's just not good optics, if nothing else.
Right. Well, and to just factor in, you know, the report about Stugotz and everything else, it's just like, just going back to New York, it just felt like a slew of headlines that left you wondering what's going on there. And then there's also a lack of transparency from Dan, you know, not addressing the Stugotz report on air or on social media. You mean the
blow up elephant wasn't addressing?
No, he's done that bit before too. I wonder though.
Do you think it's the same elephant?
No, the others were stuffed Dumbos. When he got in trouble for talking about Trump on ESPN in like 2019, simpler times. But like sticking with the documentaries and all that stuff, like it sounds like, you know, based on the reporting, they are kind of slowly phasing out of that. They say that they'll still do it, but you know, once you kind of hit reverse on that, it's kind of hard to go the other way. Like, I guess my thing is like, do they need to be doing that? Like they to this point, they've only really done what Good Rivals, the USA Mexico one, and for Prime, and then the Boston Red Sox one for Netflix. And like, I don't know how much, I mean, they barely talked about those things on their own shows. You watch them, they didn't really have like kind of the distinct Meadowlark Media type of like flavor or style. I just wonder, like,
they were pretty replacement level. I mean, I mean that not as a criticism, but just very few documentaries these days really stand out. I wouldn't say those ones did.
Yeah, I would agree with that. They were kind of just boilerplate sports documentaries. I'm sure if you were a Red Sox fan or a soccer enthusiast, like you probably loved them, but they didn't. I don't think they broke through in the way they were looking to do when they got into documentaries. And so, you know, we'll see. I think they still have the Diana Taurasi one in the works, but it feels like they left ESPN and maybe they got too much freedom and they wanted to do kind of everything. And in the process, I think, you know, which brings us to the show. Like, did they lose sight of the main thing? Like, did they lose sight of the show? Because the show now is not the same show that they had when they first left ESPN. There's been a multitude of reasons for that, but I think the biggest one would be Stugotz has less of a presence on it. And the heart of that show has been Dan and Stugotz's relationship and the yin and yang of them. And Stugotz has not
two-hander, to use a movie term, a little bit of a two-hander, right? Like it couldn't be more polar opposites.
Yeah, and Stugotz has not regularly been a part of that show. It feels like for the last 6 months, and it really changes the dynamic of that show. And so it seems like based on the reporting, based on some of the stuff John Ourand has put out there, like it seems a little bit like they want to get back to basics and they kind of want to reinforce the show and get the show. I don't know if back on track's the right wording, but they want to, it seems like that's going to go back to being the flagship Meadowlark program with Pablo Torre finds out also kind of sprinkled in.
Which I think is how it should be. Like you know what this whole story made me think of, because the other changes have been Mike Ryan stepped down as executive producer like a year ago. He was really integral to the show's texture, vibe. It's eccentric, kind of the thing people liked about it. I would say Mike had a lot to do with.
Yes.
And he was an on-air voice, especially post ESPN. He I think also counterbalanced the things people don't like about Dan Le Batard, right? The preachy nature that if it's something you agree with or if it hits the right tone, you really like it, and he can break through and really has developed a respect from his audience that way. But at other times as they battle about on air frequently, it can feel a little bit old. It can feel a little bit stale. And I think there's just less confining Dan, which, he's still maintained a huge audience, but I think that's made the product a little bit worse. There's also like all these women who have left the show. I can't help but notice that pattern that Jessica Smetana, who you mentioned, Charlotte Wilder, Lucy Rodin, there's 3 people that they hired over the course of this company that have all stepped back or scaled back or left. That doesn't feel great. It's just all these things that kind of made it this yin and yang that I think made the show special are a little bit are gone. But as far as the network goes, it made me think of the quote, which got a lot of criticism, and at the time, given there was like a labor dispute at the company, rightly so. But when Bill Simmons said to the New York Times like 5 years ago that he wasn't treating the Ringer as an open mic night.
Yeah.
I got what he was saying.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that some other companies have illustrated what Simmons was trying to protect against. And as much as it's probably not the right thing to say when you're a CEO and your company's trying to unionize.
And you're regularly having your daughter and your dad on your shows.
Yes, exactly. Like there's a lot of holes you can poke in the statement, but if you just sort of treat it as like a mission statement for the Ringer or a mission statement for a company that's basically trying to be the Ringer, which is like what Meadowlark sort of is minus the written stuff on the website, it actually is pretty solid governing principle, which is I think Meadowlark kind of overestimated its audience in a way where they had this, I think, optimism that anything that they put together, because it had the Le Batard Show smell to it, the audience would flock to and it would be a success without thinking about, does this talent have a point of view and an audience built in? Are they good enough to hold down a show by themselves at the national type of level that we need them to be? If you look at the Ringer or the Volume that Colin Cowherd has put together, even Barstool, those Cowherd, Simmons, Portnoy, those 3 have a really good eye for saying, we're going to bring person X who wasn't in our umbrella into it, and their like point of view and the audience they've already built, coupled with our brand and our distribution and our production support, is going to elevate them to a point where they can have a standalone, profitable, popular thing. Feels like Le Batard was like, oh, by the way, this person who's like the 6th rung of our ladder is doing something where they talk about some random topic. Go check it out if you want to. It's like, well, I could have told you that wasn't going to work. And that was kind of their blueprint for building a network out, was people who you like because they chime in a dozen times throughout the 4-hour Le Batard show are now going to be talking about this niche thing that they care about, and you should therefore go chase it down. No one else is really operating like that, and I don't think that was ever going to be hugely successful. So that's them departing from what these other companies are doing that has worked, I feel like is the biggest mistake that they've made.
I think a part of that too is, I mean, like just as I've been a diehard fan of the show for probably close to 15 years at this point, like definitely over 10 years. Like I've been very involved in that community. And I would say, I feel like there's been kind of a loss of a community around the show. And that's something that Dan always talked about, was the community they have around the show and how he was willing to take this leap, leaving ESPN because he knew that the community would follow him. And I think even just speaking to the lack of transparency over the report about Stugotz, it's like we're getting more information right now from Mike Ryan's private Twitter service, his Twitter subscriptions, than we are from the show itself, which seemingly always prided itself on like keeping the audience in the loop and being transparent and not talking to us like we're dumb. And I think as a lot of these business things have happened, you've had, podcasts get canceled. You've had talent, I don't know if you could say exodus at this point, but you just named off, a half a dozen talent who have kind of moved around places since over the course of the last few years. And when it's not,
they're basically back to the original crew at this
point.
Right.
And so that's when you did have that original crew, then you would kind of get that built-in equity where it's like, you know what, I will listen to a podcast that Billy Gill co-hosts. I mean, Mike Ryan went from producer to talent basically on his own. And so like, I do think when you have that community, then you can take some of those leaps of faith, but I don't get that sense that community is still there and just exploring their Reddit. I don't think that's like an unpopular sentiment. So I think like I would just like
uncertainty in the like the Reddit and just people even on Twitter or whatever. It's kind of just like, what's going on?
Yeah. And so that's, to the Stugotz thing. So the Stugotz thing is I did think the report was not fairly phrased in terms of the headline. I think the headline was that he was stepping back from Meadowlark Media, which made it sound like he was leaving Meadowlark, which isn't the case. I mean, he was on the show Monday and he's going to have a reduced role, and he's had a reduced role. But I do think when that report is out there, like it should be addressed. And I found it disappointing that it wasn't addressed.
Yeah. And not only not addressed, but like trying to kind of tease at it, not only with the elephant thing, but even he posted a picture of himself and said at the studio the next day, it said like, I'm here,
right?
Whatever. It kind of brings me to the last thing, and I'll try to keep it short because I went long on the last point that I made. But I think like the other element that made that show really break out at ESPN was obviously the us against them kind of, not just with Le Batard's political stuff, but just always kind of making fun of, almost like, can you believe we're here? We're the guys inside the room poking fun and putting whoopee cushions down at all the other people in the room that are stuffy old, sports media execs, whatever. Like that was a big part of its charm. But it almost feels like in the environments that they're trying to compete in now, which is primarily YouTube and, digital platforms, even to the degree that they still goof around and try to do that stuff, they're always going to be a step behind compared to, of course, like truly chaotic young people culture on those platforms. But even like McAfee. I mean, McAfee just swooped around and stole their lunch money, basically. It's like you're never going to outdo that vibe, considering that McAfee's already doing it, where they're going to, legal repercussions be damned, talk about something like the Ole Miss saga, and they're going to dip into, they're going to curse and be loose and have actual, like, transgressive personalities like Boston Connor or whatever, who's going to talk about conspiracies and try to get in trouble every chance he gets. Like, you're never going to compete with that stuff in the same way. So I do think it's a little bit of like finding what the North Star is, because on YouTube you're one of a million people trying to act like that. At ESPN you were the only one, right?
Well, I think the push and pull for them, and it's certainly not unique to them. I mean, this is the eternal push and pull of being in this industry, is you want to do good stuff, but you also want to do stuff that people are watching. And those that there's not always an overlap in those two things. And so like you can want to do like a very creative type of radio show or make a creative type of documentary, but at the end of the day, like you need people to watch it. And I think you have seen like some attempts from Dan to like address topics and to talk about topics that are more aimed at getting eyeballs. I mean, that's for it's a gold mine for us, because as much as he talks about like ESPN and Stephen A. Smith and all that stuff, it becomes content for us to write about. But you also get the sense like the audience is like kind of over Stephen A. Smith talk.
And everyone's doing it too, right? Like Marcellus Wiley has a YouTube channel in his basement where he mines our headlines and does reactions to it. So good luck beating that out, you know, like, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I think it's just kind of a push and pull. I think that they just have not found that happy medium, and it's a different time for the show. The other thing is Dan and Stu are 20 years into this thing. Like, they literally just celebrated their 20th anniversary. There have been times where I've wondered, like, have I just heard everything Dan Le Batard has to say on every topic? Like, I can kind of predict his stances because I've listened to him for 4 hours a day now for 15 years. And so I do wonder if there's some of that. I wonder if like they're just kind of in this weird transition where they need to figure out what the next phase of the show is. But yeah, I mean, it's been impossible not to notice the slew of headlines over the last couple of weeks.